Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you're able to tune in to this In Conversation with special episode. My name's Dave Sleet. I'm Managing Director of A&A Psychological Accreditation. And in this episode, I'm joined by Joe Liveston, who some of you may have seen in other episodes in the In Conversation series. Joe and I are going to be discussing deprivation of liberty. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm really looking forward to this. This is one of those topics that we're seeing more and more being spoken about as a result of C19. And it's something that I think is vitally important that the awareness is raised. So I want to thank you for your time. And on the back of the conversation that we did earlier this month around the whole process of mental capacity and kind of introducing that concept to people, we got a massive response, and I want to say a special thank you to everyone that's taken part and given feedback on that conversation. But that's led us to this.
Yes.
And it's also led us to a ticketed event on mental capacity on the 8th of April, where we're going to look in a bit more detail at the scenarios, the who's, the whys, the wheres, etc.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to get a ticket for that event and get more of an understanding of mental capacity and the assessment process and the scenarios around that, then check out the links on the website and on the social media platforms, but also in the description of this video, there will be a link there as well. So, Joe, first big kind of, I don't want to say question because it's bigger than that, but what is deprivation of liberty?
Right, okay. So it's big and it's complicated, but in simple terms, deprivation of liberty is preventing somebody from moving around freely, in a nutshell.
Which is pretty much what the entire planet has been through in some way, shape or form.
It is. It's like that is slightly different because that was legal and lawful because there was a law introduced to allow for it. Mm-hmm. So deprivation of liberty is against the law unless you do it by a lawful means. Now, those lawful means could be the COVID-19 legislation. Mm-hmm. They could be that you've committed a crime and you're incarcerated as a result of that crime. Mm-hmm. They could be that you need to be sectioned under the mental health legislation, and then you are having your movement automatically restricted because you're going to be put into a hospital of some description. So those are the kind of sort of normal ways that you might instantly think of. Mm-hmm. And the only other way is through a court, basically. So a court order. Mm-hmm. And it just means that you can't. So it can be as small as a single room, that you're not allowed to leave that single room. It could be a building. It could be a street. It could be it's actually, even on one occasion, it's been a whole island. So that person was deemed to be deprived of their liberty because they were not allowed to leave that island. So it's quite interesting.
It covers a massive range of scenarios as to why somebody could have their deprivation, their liberty deprived.
Yes.
And as you say, the majority of the examples will be legally in place through either justice or mental health.
Yes.
And therefore there has to be safeguards in place.
Yes.
To ensure that we're not depriving liberty of somebody without that due process.
Yes.
So what is, in essence, what is DoLS? What is the deprivation of liberty safeguards?
Safeguards. So the safeguards is the important bit, really, rather than the deprivation of liberty bit. And they've been enforced since 2009. They are for vulnerable adults. So any adult who can't give valid consent to be in a hospital or a care home in order to receive treatment or care, that's who it applies to.
Okay.
It can apply to people under 18 if they're 16 plus, but that has to be done via court. It can't be done via the normal DoLS process. The normal DoLS process applies to 18 and over.
Okay.
Yeah,
and we'll touch on the process in a moment. But I know why I think it's important that the therapeutic community and the wider community understands DoLS, as in the deprivation of liberty safeguards, and it's important that we're talking about the safeguards here.
Yes.
Because we've seen a huge rise as a result of C19 of people who were already in restrictive environments,
yes,
having those safeguards almost not put in place, simply because of the bigger scenario that we found ourselves in.
Yep.
And that's led to a lot of people reaching out for therapeutic support because they see the deterioration in loved ones around them in regards to their liberty being restricted. Yep. But why do you, as a best interest practitioner, see that this is something that therapeutic community, why is it important for you to get this message?
I would say it's twofold. It's the thing that you said about people wanting to reach out for some support whilst they're trying to kind of battle against the vast restrictions that people are having to put up with at the moment. And even just finding their way through the system at the best of times, to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people didn't ask for some therapeutic support. And I think it's important that people have at least a basic idea of what they might be facing and how that might present, just to give them a sort of heads up, I suppose. But secondly, we all have relatives and friends and our own lives that might apply in the same way as anybody else. Any one of us could have a sibling or a parent or a child or whoever that ends up in one of these situations where they're in a care home or a hospital and they can't give their consent. And I think it's important that we understand what provision is there behind that, so that we can advocate for them when that happens, because they're not, some places are very good and some places are really not very good. And it often relies on the relatives to push for the good to happen in situations where it maybe hasn't been.
Do you think that the family involvement, the external friend network of somebody, kind of being conscious of the system has a positive impact on those family and friend members to be able to provide that advocacy? Or do you think it becomes a bigger stretch, bigger stress for those people because they can't detach from it for the knowing?
I'm not sure that they can detach from it anyway, to be honest. So I mean, I have at the moment I'm working kind of gratis really for at least 5 families, where I'm trying to support their relatives to help them through some of the processes that they're facing, related to DoLS, related to deprivation of liberty in general, related to the right to a family life, that sort of thing. And every single one of them is struggling. And they were struggling long before we spoke about some of the measures that they could take. And in general, I've found that people generally benefit from understanding that they've got options and that there is some route that they can consider, even if they decide not to take it. It gives people a sense of hope, I suppose, you know, that there is a potential route out of that.
There's an empowerment in that knowledge, isn't there?
Yeah.
And that can have a positive impact on the person that's actually having their liberty.
Would say so.
And I think it's important to point out, just as we do in a lot of the scenarios that APA discuss, it's about the collaboration, the parallel working, the teamwork, and ultimately the open and transparent communication between everybody that's involved in that situation.
Yeah.
So ultimately, we're looking at scenarios where somebody is incapacitated either physically or mentally to be able to make decisions, and they require care to be provided to them. So this isn't just about the elderly going into a care home, is it?
Not just elderly, no. It could be any age, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, health conditions, obviously the older adult population, dementias, all of those kind of things. And it's where people can't make that decision for themselves that a care home is where they need to be, or that a hospital is where they need to be. So those 2 places are the only places where we can apply the safeguards as it currently stands.
Okay. So who can apply the safeguards, and what are the restrictions and what are the protections that are in place?
Okay, so it's complicated. You knew I was
There's
going to say
a surprise. We're in conversation with Joe Liveston, ladies and gentlemen. This is going to be complicated. Grab a pen.
It's going to be
We're going to break it down for you guys.
We'll go through it step by step as best I can. So first of all, what happens is a hospital or a care home, which is called a managing authority, will make a referral. That has to happen first.
Okay, so who are they making a referral to?
I'm going to tell you.
See how I says we're going to break it down for you, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't have to be as complex.
No, it doesn't. So they make a referral. It's normally local authorities who do it. They are called the supervisory body. So they are the umbrella over the care homes and the hospitals, which will ensure that these safeguards are in place. The person has to lack capacity to consent. If they're able to consent and they're consenting, that's fine, and they don't need to fall under the DoLS. If they are able to consent and they're not consenting, that needs to be dealt with under safeguarding processes, not DoLS. So
that's important, isn't it?
Safeguarding.
Yeah, that's important that all professionals are aware at which point DoLS kicks in.
Yeah.
And not to try using DoLS when actually capacity is in play. If
it is, then the DoLS will never become applied, because when the person is assessed by the doctor or the best interest assessor, they'll be found to not lack capacity, and therefore they won't. Yeah, they can't have a DoLS agreed.
Yeah. So just on that point, where you've got a family or a friend scenario that is driving this forward and pushing for DoLS because they don't like what is being done, or or the decisions that are being made. By pushing for DoLS when DoLS is not appropriate, it's only going to create a worse situation for everybody, because you're not using the right tool for the job. Is that fair?
Yeah, reasonably, yeah. And it could delay things quite heavily. So at the moment, there is a massive national backlog of DoLS assessments. So unless there is a urgency to the referral, which would be something like the person is continually objecting to their situation or something like that. If there's nothing like that in place, if it's a fairly kind of ordinary, for want of a better way of putting it, situation, and nobody seems to be objecting, then they'll be put on a waiting list. Those waiting lists in some places are over a year just to be assessed. So
we've got to get it right.
Yeah.
And we've got to be targeting the right use of DoLS as much as possible.
Yeah.
Which is why I wanted to kind of highlight the fact that if it's not DoLS, there are other tools available.
Yeah, much better.
And we need to be clear. Don't use DoLS if it's not a DoLS situation.
Use adult safeguarding, and it's much faster as well. You know, so it's also the correct route for that situation.
That scenario, yeah.
If it shouldn't be DoLS, then it would be safeguarding normally. So it only applies to those who lack capacity, and they have to be under a sort of level of restriction around their movement in particular. So it's things like obvious things like being in a care home and being required to live there. So that might be not obvious always, but sometimes it is very obvious that that's what the person is required to do. Some care homes, and many care homes now, are locked buildings with not just from the outside, like to stop people getting in, but from the inside to prevent people from leaving without supervision or permission or whatever. So those kind of measures, which are very obvious, would be part of the restrictions that might be in place. But there are other restrictions that are often put in place, which as a best interest assessor, I will flag up as part of my assessment. So they might be things like certain types of medication, for example, or it could be that the person is physically held at certain times because they need to have a wash, or they need some medical procedure doing that they can't tolerate without somebody restricting them from sort of flailing around or whatever. They're going to hurt themselves maybe if they're not prevented from that. Yeah. Some people will behave in ways which might put them at risk towards other people, and if they do that, then part of the restriction might be that the carers will step in and prevent that from happening. So they might literally stand in front of them or turn them around and walk them a different direction. Yeah, that kind of stuff. So
and those physical restrictions, those physical boundaries, they have to be provided by an appropriately trained and qualified individual. Is that right?
Not necessarily.
That's really important. That is really important to clarify.
Yeah, depends what they are. Obviously, certain like medication, for example, obviously has to be prescribed and overseen by a medical professional. So that might be a psychiatrist if it's psychiatric medication, or it might be a GP or something if it's physical medication. There are other things like, let's see, seat belts on wheelchairs, cot sides on beds, pressure mats to show when somebody's got up out of a chair, that sort of thing. Those things are often applied either by a nurse, potentially. Things like bedsides are often done by a nurse, but things like pressure mats, alarms on doors, stuff like that, it's usually just a carer, care home manager, a social worker maybe, you know.
And they're passive interventions, aren't they?
They are, but they still count as a restriction under the legislation.
I'm more referring to where there has to be physical contact to restrain or prevent, physical activity, that has to be done appropriately.
Yes. Yeah.
At all times. Okay, so we've got a general kind of consensus around some of those kind of safeguards and the restrictions that can apply.
Yep.
What are the protections?
So the protections are that the assessment process comes into play then. So there are 6 assessments as a part of a DoLS referral.
Okay.
And those 6 assessments are conducted by a best interest assessor like me, and a mental health professional, which is usually a psychiatrist, but not always. Sometimes it's a specially trained GP. So that can be a little bit mixed. Some of the assessments are very simple. Some of them are more complex. So what I propose we do is whisk through the simple ones, and then I'll spend a little bit of time trying to explain the more complex one. And the most complex ones are the mental capacity assessment, which we covered in our last conversation, and the best interest assessment.
Check out the link for that video as well, guys. These 2 things are interlinked, aren't they?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
So
yeah,
it is worth checking out the introduction to mental capacity assessment that we've already done with Joe, and
probably that one first really is ideal.
Don't press pause on this one, go watch that and come back. No, this isn't GMTV, you can watch this one and then you can go watch the other one, right? But we are very conscious that these 2 things are interlinked. And professionals who this is the first time that they're hearing about mental capacity then you will really kind of benefit from having both sets of knowledge for this. So Joe, section 1,
the assessments. So all of the assessments are all geared towards the Article 5 of the Human Rights Act. Article 5 of the Human Rights Act talks about freedom of movement, basically. So that's the area on which they focus. What I want to do at the end, and your job is to remind me because I might forget.
Ladies and gentlemen, please leave your comments to remind me to ask this question. Ready, Joe? Go for it.
I want you to remind me to talk about the Article 8 issues, which are related, but they're not part of DoLS. So the 6 assessments are you ready? So the first one, number 1, is an age assessment. And that is purely, is the person over 18? That's it. Easy. Okay. So,
check.
So occasionally we have to do a guesstimate that person is over 18, but usually we have their date of birth and that's been confirmed by some route or another. It's on their records, it's on their birth certificate, it's on their passport, whatever. So it's literally a question of write in their date of birth or write their estimated age if their date of birth isn't known. So that's quite simple. It's usually very obvious that the person is aged 18 or over. So that's one of them. The best interest assessor will do that one. Then there is an assessment called no refusals. Now, no refusals is about, again, done by the best interest assessor. No refusals is about treatment specifically. So not so much the where are you going to live or where are you going to be to have this treatment or care, but have you used the Mental Capacity Act provision to put in place an advanced decision to refuse that treatment. So it's more for hospital care, really. So it's for the people who might have refused life-sustaining kind of treatment on a ventilator or something. Mm-hmm. So you might have refused that with an advanced decision. In that situation, when the best interest assessor finds that you've refused that, under a valid advanced decision, then any life support that you might be on will be withdrawn, because you've made a valid advanced decision for that not to be the case.
Yeah.
If somebody were to object to that, then it would be taken to court, and the court would undoubtedly decide that it would be withdrawn, because that was the person's decision. So,
that's where we've seen kind of major cases that hit the High Court to kind of allow end of life with respect, and those decisions invariably go in favour of the decision maker when the decision is made early enough.
Yes,
it's when it's made at a point of depression or that it tends to get complicated, and so those no refusals are about what's around that situation. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
What you can't do in those no refusals is refuse to go into a care home. So that's something that you can't do as an advanced decision. So I guess anybody sitting there thinking, oh, well, maybe I could just refuse to ever be put in a care home, you can't.
No. I've seen Waiting for God and I don't like it. I'm not going. No, it's that one area of safeguarding that is locked in, isn't it?
It is. But the other assessment that is quite straightforward is the mental health assessments. Although that sounds like it might not be straightforward, it is literally the doctor just going, yes, that person has X, and that condition might mean that they can't give their valid consent to be here. That's it. So it'll be like they've got dementia, or they've got a learning disability, or they've had a stroke, or whatever it is. Even if there's no definitive diagnosis, they will give a likely diagnosis in that situation.
And at that point, does that instigate the mental capacity assessment before DoLS?
Yes, always. Yeah.
And that has, as you took the words out of my mouth, that always has to happen when that process in the DoLS assessment is. I
mean, lawfully we could do it in any order we wanted, but in practice, most of us choose to do a mental capacity assessment as one of the first assessments that we do, because if the person can consent, then we don't need the DoLS. So there's pointless going through all of these other things.
Yeah, and this is why I said it's really, really important that we're using the right tool,
the right thing. Yeah,
because. And as you rightly said, when you go down this road and you haven't done the pre-checks, if you like, it's going to throw you back to the beginning to get those pre-checks done. It's going to slow the process down. And that only creates anxiety, animosity, and complexities that don't necessarily need to be there.
Yeah, it does. So the doctor also will do another assessment called eligibility. And that one is purely whether the person should be dealt with under mental health legislation or mental capacity legislation. So in other words, do they need to be sectioned? Or are they under a post-section requirement to live where they're living? Because if they are, they fall under the mental health laws. And the reason for that is because the mental health laws have a stronger sort of presence around the protections that are in place for people, advocacy and that sort of thing. So it's deemed to be less restrictive to use that legislation than it is to use the Mental Capacity Act.
So the whole kind of scenario is at every stage making sure that we know we're working with the right scenario, the right piece of legislation, and almost making sure that the kind of the due process and due diligence is run side by side with the kind of the scenario that somebody is actually experiencing.
Yes. Yeah. So have I done 5? Is that 5? I've lost my count.
Yes, I think so.
The big one then. So the big one is the best interest assessment. That's the one that the best interest assessor, surprise, surprise, is there.
Wonder who that could be.
I can't imagine. So it has 4 stages in essence. So the first stage is defining that this person is subject to a deprivation of liberty. So it's about looking at what restrictions are in place. Is that enough to warrant this term of deprivation of liberty? That's usually pretty straightforward these days, because there is a famous landmark case which set up a thing called the acid test, and it basically looks at, is the person free to go where they want, when they want? Are they able to make that decision for themselves? And are they being prevented from doing what they want to do, basically?
Can I just ask, in that, is there an awareness or a kind of safe check against coercion?
Not necessarily, because sometimes people are coerced as part of the deprivation. So it could be that the coercion is part of what we're safeguarding against if it's going too far, but it could also be that coercion is necessary and is less restrictive than the alternatives.
And part of that, the assessment, the best interest assessment, is
for me to
work out whether or not any coercion is in the best interest, not just the simple fact that there is coercion.
Exactly.
And I think it's very clear that when anyone is looking at that scenario, coercion isn't always a negative.
It isn't,
and it shouldn't be used in that way.
No, there's lots of times when I can think of, for example, the older adults maybe with dementia at the door trying to get out. They're going to be really unsafe if we let them out. They're getting distressed, perhaps, at not being able to get out. So what are we going to do? We're going to leave them? No, we're going to maybe say, oh, let's go and have a cup of tea. We're going to distract them, aren't we? Or we're going to cajole them to come with us and go and do something else, to take their mind off trying to get out of the store. They're not allowed out.
Yeah, and that refocusing can be done in a various number of ways. But for family, for friends looking at this scenario, please don't see the term coercion as a negative unless it's assessed to be negative. But the word will be used in and around scenario, but it's got its own connotations, and we know that.
It has.
But we have to be mindful that the best interest assessors are there to work with the family at making sure that is not a negative coercion. It is there for the best interest.
And that it's done in the best possible way for that individual, that it's not just done, well, it's done this way because we do it this way with everybody. That's, we don't like that, really.
Ladies and gentlemen, please frog march your way down the corridor and away from the door.
It happens an awful lot in care homes, that people are given a sort of blanket policy. This is what we do here, and therefore you have to fit into that. When it comes to DoLS assessments, often we can influence that and change it, because it has to be individual. So it can be a really positive process, in terms of getting things better for people rather than something negative. Which it sounds like it is, but it isn't really.
Yeah, and that kind of regime approach invariably comes about because the operation is not flexible in its engagement with its individual.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's where we see catastrophes take place and abusive environments.
It is.
So the best interest assessment really can be a cornerstone of positive care environments.
Totally.
When it's used appropriately, when those best interest assessments are actually implemented after the assessment.
Yeah.
And
well, they have to be. If they're under DoLS, they have to be, and we'll go through that later when I get to the the reviews and things. We'll get to that. So stage 2, get back in your box.
My liberty to express is being deprived, ladies and gentlemen.
It is, yeah.
All for the best interests of the audience.
Indeed. Yes. So the second stage of the best interest assessment is looking at whether the restrictions that are in place, are they necessary to prevent harm to that person? So not to anybody else, just purely to that individual person. So where it's people who might be violent, for example, towards another, the only way that you could include that as part of your rationale would be if there was a likelihood that those other individuals might retaliate, for example, or that there might be damage to their social interactions if they weren't prevented from said violence, which obviously you could argue would definitely be the case, but you can't say this is necessary to protect Fred next door, because it doesn't work like that. It has to be that one individual. So that's the second stage. The third stage is whether those measures are proportionate to the risk. So it's a question of, like, are we going too far, basically? Are we going too far, or are we not going far enough? And that's sort of looking at those aspects and weighing it up is the fourth stage. So the fourth stage is this in the person's best interests, basically? So the courts will insist on using what they call a balance sheet approach, which means looking at the positives and the negatives of doing this thing or not doing this thing, and then weighing up which is the best thing to do and why. So that's what comes into that last section, is weighing up all of the alternatives and coming to a conclusion as to what you're recommending, basically. What are you saying should happen in the future? Okay,
quick question. We have a system of advocacy in the UK judicial process. It's been around for quite a while. It's doing, it's not brilliant, we know that. It's not a perfect system, but it is pretty damn good at what it needs to do when it's used appropriately. Where we've got a situation where one assessment is being presented, all of the processes are done, who represents the person at the center of that in the event that the assessment and the process is being challenged?
The person is represented by, you'll like this, they're called the relevant person's representative.
Ta-da! The UK doing its best to keep things simple.
Now that person is either appointed by the person's lasting power of attorney, if they have one, or they are appointed by the best interest assessor. So often the best interest assessor will look at who are the closest people to this person, who might this person pick for themselves if they could, or if they can, actually. Sometimes they can say who they want to help them, so obviously then you would take their wishes, as long as the person was capable and willing, then there's no reason why they couldn't take it on.
Can a family in certain circumstances, can they have a independent professional fill that role?
Yes. So there are a thing called an IMCA, which is an independent mental capacity advocate, and that person can be appointed to represent the individual. Or they can also, and I often think this is better personally, they can be appointed to support the representative. Now that's my personal kind of choice as often the best route, because that way you've got the person who knows the person and knows what they would have wanted in the past if they're no longer able to express their view, or you know, just understands what they mean maybe when they're saying certain things. But you've also got the professional person who knows the law and knows the legal processes that they can go through to challenge the DoLS. So everybody has access once these DoLS are put into place by the supervisory body. So it's usually the local authority, which we spoke about earlier. So these 6 assessments, they all go back to the local authority. And the lead people in the local authority look at them, make sure they're happy with the content, and then they sign it off, essentially. So they sign it off, and then everybody gets all these very legal documents saying, yes, you're allowed to continue to deprive this person of their liberty. It's lawful because it's under these safeguards. And these are the conditions to which are attached to that, if there are any. And then, but if the person is still objecting, they still have to have a court hearing. So they will carry on doing what they need to do. Everything will stay the same. But in the background, this representative will need to take a case to court on their behalf, even if they don't agree with them. So even if it's, you know, somebody who's obviously objecting to their situation, everybody else thinks it's the right thing to do. Makes no difference. They still have to go to court. Yeah. So that's part of
that right has to be protected as well, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And sometimes courts have overturned them. They have overturned them, and that's really important, you know. And they've also recognised, which I think is vital, maybe for this audience to hear, is that the courts very much take the social and the psychological as just as important as the physical side of things. So there was a famous case, I can't remember what her name was, but she was an ex-social worker, and she ended you might know, she ended up in a care home. She was very well known for campaigning, and she was a big feminist, and there was lots of history from her kind of fighting the system through her whole life, really. And she ended up in a care home. She was miserable as sin. She hated it. And every single day she asked to go home. She didn't have capacity, but she wanted to go. She wanted to go home. And in the end, she was on a DoLS. Somebody took it to court to appeal on her behalf, because that's what she wanted to do. And when the judge heard her history and her wish to be at home, he said, oh, hello. Something I said.
Hello. Ding, ding.
He said it was a judge called Justice Mumby, who's quite famous, and he said there is no point in keeping somebody safe if it only makes them miserable. And I think that's really powerful to remember. So she was discharged back home, and it wasn't perfect. She was at more risk of certain things, but psychologically, guess what? She was much better. So the courts are very clear that that's just as valid a reason to do or not do something as any other, you know. So they place quite a lot of weight on people's wishes, people's previous wishes, what people are suggesting through their behaviour if they're not talking, or both. And obviously it can get quite complex, but the protections are there for people to make an appeal against what is happening to them, and that's really important. I
was going to say the flip side of the UK's justice system in this case, just as in very many other cases, is that right to appeal after the decision has been made.
Kind of like, you know, if we put somebody in prison for a crime they've committed or been found guilty of, we put them in prison, they have a right of appeal, don't they? They can go to the Court of Appeal and appeal their sentence or appeal their conviction. If we put somebody under a section of the Mental Health Act, there is an appeals process. So this is just the same. The appeals process looks slightly different, but it's essentially the same thing.
And it comes down to, ultimately, the basis of this was in the human rights legislation.
Yeah.
So Article 5 was the base.
Yep. That's what the DoLS is about, is Article 5. Freedom of movement, Article 5. Okay. Article 8 is about the right to a private and family life. So Article 8, in terms of DoLS, means that as a best interest assessor, I can flag up Article 8 issues as something that I want a local authority to look at. I can't force them. They usually will, because they don't like to go against an independent legal assessment that could be challenged in court. So they tend to go with what you recommend, as long as you've got good reasoning behind what you're recommending. Yeah. So Article 8 issues in care homes up until before COVID-19 were things like, let's say there was a safeguarding issue or a suspected safeguarding issue with some of the visitors. It might be that that person has their visits supervised. It might be that their visits are restricted to a certain period of time or certain days of the week or whatever. There may be some people who get very distressed when they see certain individuals, and it may be that for their psychological well-being, allegedly, that the care home or hospital thinks that it's better for them to be prevented from seeing that person or restricted to seeing them for a shorter period of time in order to manage their distress. Personally, I don't really buy that, but you know, that's what they would say. The COVID-19 issue has kind of made that even more, what's the word I'm looking for?
High profile.
Yes, thank you. Because obviously, due to the lockdown and things, the all of the care homes pretty much closed their doors, wouldn't let any visitors come in. Many of them failed to put anything else in place for a long time. So months, generally, unless the person was literally at death's door. Then they weren't letting people have phone calls, they weren't facilitating video contact, they weren't writing to people regularly and updating them. They were literally just ignoring relatives.
Yeah, and there were horror stories of alleged abandonments across Europe in care homes, where the care providers were simply not on site and people were left to their own devices for fear of contamination. And
yep, that happened too. There were care homes where all of the staff literally moved in for several months and they didn't leave.
And this is the thing with all pandemics. C-19 has captured the world.
Yeah.
This is what has happened wherever pandemics and the vulnerable populations have been concerned. We saw it with Ebola, we saw it with SARS. Yep. Just because it wasn't on our doorstep, it wasn't affecting our families, doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
No.
And this is where I think a lot of the learning around DoLS awareness has really come into its own. Because we've got to get to a point where that will to live that comes from that human connection is seen just as importantly as the physical capacity to live. And when we deprive somebody of that contact, you can be in a room full of people and be lonely. We know that. But what that does to us, the impact psychologically and emotionally, degrades that will to live. And we've seen article after article, news report after news report that shows the before and after. That shows
and
that
I've spoken to so many people now where they've got relatives and they've seen deterioration. They feel that they're being shut out, literally and figuratively as well. Everything they've tried is just meeting with a brick wall. There are lots of care homes that are just behaving quite abusively, I would say. I think they're going too far. They're going much too far, because every resident now in a care home in this country, or at least in England, has received at least one vaccine. Every single resident. So in terms of risk, the risk is lowered because of the vaccine. But the restrictions that were in place at the very, very start of the pandemic are still there.
And,
so
and it's that balance, isn't it? We haven't
shifted the balance. No, they haven't. They're not consulting with relatives. They're not making individualized decisions about each person and how important or not it is for that individual to have that contact, and who with, how, for how long, those kind of things.
To everyone that is watching this, that is connected to this scenario, I want to say a personal message. Thank you for not giving up on those people, your loved ones, that have been caught up in it. Thank you for going to the doors. Thank you for going to the windows. Thank you for keeping that contact where it has been possible, because you have done more than you will ever realize for the emotional and psychological well-being of your loved one. However difficult the pandemic has been, it has been critical to those people that have been having their liberty, that contact to be held, even if it's just moments. Thank you for keeping that alive. That's from me.
I agree.
Joe, I want to kind of bring this to a close on some positives.
Okay.
This is a piece of legislation that is relatively new on the statute.
It is 2009.
Okay. And it's come about from some horrific experiences that were in play.
Yep.
And as you say, it's still, there are still examples where this is not being applied and it's not being implemented, even once reports are done. And we know that there is a sheer backlog.
Yes, there is.
But the positive impacts of these safeguards have saved lives.
They have, and they've moved people from one place to another where they weren't in the right place. They have prevented certain actions where people have gone too far and just been too restrictive in what they were doing, and it's been pulled back because of those assessments. So it saves a lot of heartache, I think, in when it's applied properly and in a timely fashion.
Do you think that for the therapeutic community, who invariably are working with family members of those that are in that situation rather than directly with people in that situation. And that's something I think is actually abhorrent. My gut instinct is that actually anyone that's in that situation should be benefiting from therapeutic and emotional support as a standard. It's part of the gold package, if you like. That's what needs to be in place. We're not there yet because of all of the other scenarios that we know about. But for those therapists that are working with family members that are connected, do you think having a wider understanding of what DoLS is, how DoLS works, what that process is an empowerment for those professionals as well?
I would say yes, definitely, because it gives you some sort of sense of hope, I suppose, that there are routes that people can use and that there are kind of provisions in place that can be utilized to achieve a better outcome.
And I think that's the key for all of the professionals that are watching this. For anyone who has family in this scenario that is watching this, I hope that having the know-how around the process, understanding that the information from the MTA and introduction that Joe's already done with APA will give you some more tools to make life easier for you, either in your work or in supporting your family. But this job isn't done yet, is it, Joe? We still have care homes.
Of course it isn't. No. They're going to change the law again.
There we go. So
they're going to change it to something called Liberty Protection Safeguards.
Okay, so we've got another set of letters to brace ourselves for in, is it 2020?
I'm going to turn my video off just because.
There we go.
It's 2022, April 2022. Mm-hmm. The Liberty Protection Safeguards will replace DoLS.
And is there an upscale, an upgrade of that, those protections?
And the doctor, they will be assessed by what's called the responsible body. The responsible body will be the person who is providing the care or support or treatment. So in most cases, it will be the care.
And Joe's bounced out again. So there are clear changes coming, and the process and protections as it's been outlined in public reports so far would indicate that that process is making things tighter and those protections are stronger. And Joe, you're back in the room. Have we got sound? Is Joe back?
I can't see you. Are you there?
Okay, we can hear you, we can see you.
I'm going to turn my video off again because we're obviously having a few technical issues.
The gremlins have decided.
I haven't got much more to say, so I'll say it quickly. So Liberty Protection Safeguards. Coming in April 2022.
And we're losing Joe again. So I will wrap this up. We will put a short piece together and link it to this video around the developments for 2022, so everyone has a chance to see those. For now, I want to thank Jo for her time and her experience and knowledge in sharing with us around the topic of DoLS. I want to thank everyone who's taken the time to join us and to watch this. So hopefully you have a new level of empowerment to support your clients and support family and friends going through this process. If you've gained knowledge that is practical for your professional development, get yourself the CPD questionnaire from the description in this video. Get that back to us and receive the CPD certificate. If you're an APA member, that's completely free. If you're not an APA member yet, question 1, why not? Question 2, how would you like that CPD certificate? Just an administration. But for now, wherever you are, whenever you're watching this, take care, and we'll see you on another episode of In Conversation With very, very soon. Bye-bye for now.